Ms. Davis, for what purpose?
Will the gentleman yield for a couple of questions?
Will the gentleman yield for questions?
Be happy to yield for questions of my friend from Dallas.
Thank you, Chairman Ashby. Let me, first of all, applaud your efforts in trying to bring broadband to its greatest extent here in the state of Texas. I certainly appreciate and recognize the value it would provide for all Texans. But I have a couple of questions about it because, again, this is one of those programs where we're incentivizing companies to come forward and provide a service to Texans. Having been on a committee several times relative to these kinds of investments in our community, we have been unable to get specific information regarding where services are provided, where services are under-provided. We've been difficult to get anything regarding what the state gets for that investment. So I have some concerns with regard to us moving forward with this kind of investment without asking for specific reports to come to the members of the legislature so we know what communities have been left behind, what speeds are in different communities. And so I want to be clear that in your bill, it doesn't specify any of that. And I want to make sure that you understand that I'm offering amendments to get reports back to us so that everyone who votes for broadband, I suspect there's no one in this room that does not want Texas to be connected.
That's right.
I certainly want it to be connected.
Yes, ma'am.
But having been here for many years, I've watched us invest in these kinds of programs and incentivize companies to move forward to find out that we can't tell how many jobs are actually created. We can't tell, we can't get information on where those jobs were created. We can't get any kind of information regarding a deployment plan so we can set expectations up for our communities. We can't tell why certain speeds are different in certain communities and some have access. We know that there's been cherry picking. Your bill doesn't speak to any of that, does it?
The bill specifically doesn't speak to it, but if I could, I can elaborate on reporting requirements that address, I think, some of the concerns that you just expressed.
And so my concern is that we as legislators aren't able to get that information. And if we don't ask for it in the legislation, how can we be assured that, in fact, we will get that information? Because I've been on committees where I've asked about these kinds of investment tools that the state has put in place. We incentivize companies, and I think it's the right thing to do with the business model to have business and public and private working together. But I think when we're about to spend $5 to $8 billion in this state, we ought to have some way to know where, who, what, and your bill is just void in that area. As a result of that, I have amendments.
If I could, let me hopefully allay your concerns, because I think that we have more than addressed them, or they will be more than addressed. I think it's important, members, to understand that the money we're talking about today is state funding. But this money will largely serve on the broadband side of it as a 25% match to the federal BEAD program. And as you can imagine, for us to qualify for that federal funding, which we don't know the amount that Texas is eligible to receive yet, but it's estimated between $2 and $4 billion for broadband deployment, that we are going to be required as a state through our Broadband Development Office to provide quarterly status reports over the duration of the project to confirm milestones are being met, a final report that describes the completed project, final report certifications, which will contain an expense and revenue summary of the project, and a certification that the project was completed as proposed in the application. These requirements, reporting requirements, I might add, meet the requirements that are set forth by the U.S. Treasury for ARPA-related dollars. And with respect to the NTIA that oversees the BEAD funding, they have indicated in their NOFO, or Notice of Funding Opportunity, that state broadband offices all across our country, Ms. Davis, that they will need to ensure that each subgrantee deploys its funded networks and begins providing broadband service to each customer that desires broadband service not later than 4 years after the date on which the grantee receives the grant for the applicable network. States will also require applicants to establish different milestones enforceable as conditions of this federal money, sufficient to ensure that the recipients are making reasonable progress toward meeting the deployment in any violation of the, and this is just a very quick summary of some of the qualifications to receive this federal money, but any determination by the federal government that we are in non-compliance or non-performance with these different reporting requirements that they have laid out and that we must comply with, that we will not be reimbursed with the federal money that we're looking for.
But my question remains the same. Whether it's federal money or state money, they're detached to provide a service to the citizens of this state. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, say that one more time.
These funds are made available to provide a service in this state. They're designed
broadband service, correct.
Is that correct? Whether it's state or federal, that's the ultimate goal, is that we will achieve.
Connect Texans.
And so my concern, I guess I'm having a difficulty understanding why reporting all of a sudden is a bad thing. It would appear to me that we would want to know where we're creating jobs. We've done monies like this, incentivize entities to come and get tax breaks, if you will. But we don't know what happens. When you ask the industry to provide you with that data, it's not readily available. They will direct you to a map with no numbers with it. So what's wrong with a specific report that says, this is what we did with the money, this is how many jobs we hired, this is we created? I mean, what is wrong with an in-depth report to suggest that we would know where and who benefits from this $5 billion investment, that even though it's not all state money, it's federal money, we all pay federal taxes.
That's right.
So we want accountability there as well. Wouldn't you agree?
I absolutely agree. And what I would say to you, Ms. Davis, on the reporting side of the question, is that in addition to what I just laid out from what the feds are going to require, of course, our state, through our Broadband Development Office, they also have to issue reports. And so you talked about the mapping, trying to determine who has access to broadband and who doesn't. That already was in House Bill 5. Now, I think it's important also to recall, Ms. Davis, that we just stood up our state Broadband Development Office about 18 months ago. They have 5 employees. We haven't issued our first grant yet, but as soon as those grants are provided to those applicants, or awarded rather, they will be required to provide reports both to the legislature as well as the condition of the federal monies that we're talking about for the ARPA funds and the BEAD program that is coming online, hopefully later this year. There are already substantial reporting requirements that are going to be provided, I think, that will address many of the concerns that you have.
I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I lost all of that. I can't hear you.
Members, please take your conversations outside the rail.
I'm sorry. Did you hear my answer? Well, it was a great answer. I'm not sure I can be as eloquent in the second try, but I'll try.
Let me give you another question. Let me give you a question. How many providers in your mind are there in the state of Texas that will be accessing these funds?
How many providers?
Yeah.
Well, we know that there are over 300 providers in the state of Texas.
And so if we assume that 300 providers are going to participate in this program, how are we to know who's doing what in what areas of the state if we don't get a report?
Well, what I'm trying to suggest, Ms. Davis, is that they are required to provide a report. When I say they, I'm talking about the state of Texas. None of these grants are going to be made that don't involve federal funding, okay? We're talking about the 25% state match to go along with the BEAD funding, which is coming on later this year. That's what this bill is contemplating, okay? And I'm sorry. And so what I'm telling you, as a condition of the receiving those federal dollars, that we as a state through our BDO, we are going to be required to provide those reports that you're talking about, looking at who has access to broadband and who doesn't. Very importantly, both to the state as well as to the federal government.
As members of the legislature, why are we unable to get that report directly from the comptroller, who is a manager of this program? Why would we not want the comptroller to provide each of us with a report of who, where, when? Because over the years, it's never been made available to members. How many jobs were created when we did the tax breaks to do infrastructure before, technology infrastructure? Where were they created? How many people were still unconnected, or not connected? I'm just suggesting that the report that we can get now does not answer those questions, and if we don't put it in the legislation, how are we to know as members that in fact this happened? That they created the jobs that they said, where they said, that they created, they closed loopholes of vacancies where there was no connection, what kind of services in different communities. If we don't capture that information and it's not presented to us, how in the world are we supposed to figure it out? Because in hearings, when we've asked those questions, information has not been made available.
So thank you for the question. So in response, Ms. Davis, let me just suggest to you again, when you say that over the years, reports or information hasn't been provided to the legislature, the BDO has only been in operation for 18 months.
I understand.
They have yet to award their first grant, okay? Now, as far as other reports that don't apply to the distribution of funding, what I would suggest to you is that they have, in my opinion, of course, they have always been responsive to any request of reporting that I'm aware of. The other thing that I would say, Mrs. Davis, is keep in mind that is an office of 5 employees that has been drinking from a fire hydrant since we stood them 18 months ago to do the mapping and develop the state broadband plan that we required them to do on House Bill 5. So to be fair to them,
I'm not suggesting that they have spent money yet.
Okay.
I'm suggesting that as we go into a greater program to do something that we have incentivized and been involved in over the years, I'm suggesting that based on the amount of information that's been made available to members at request in committee hearings, they've not been able to answer those questions. And so it makes sense that as we develop a broader program with more money to cover more people, that we would in fact insist on collecting the data that tells us if it's doing what it's supposed to do in the state of Texas. That's all I'm saying is your bill doesn't do that. And if your bill is the master plan for developing this new business infrastructure broadband across our state, wouldn't we want the bill to be as inclusive as possible to keep members informed? That's the question that I have, and that's the question I'm saying. Your bill doesn't cover that right now. Is that correct?
I understand. So,
but does your bill cover that right now? Your bill doesn't cover that right now in its current form. It doesn't.
So my response, Mrs. Davis, is we don't need to put in statute something that can simply be done by you or I or any member of this legislature picking up the phone and calling the BDO and asking for a report. And what I would submit to you, Ms. Davis, is that as one of the Speaker's appointees to the Broadband Development Office Board of Advisors, anytime you would like a report or any member of this legislature would like a report from the BDO, ask.
Mr. Chairman, does your bill require the companies to provide this information to the comptroller?
It is going to be a condition.
Does your bill currently ask the companies to provide to the comptroller who they serve, where they serve, the speed that they serve, what's not served? Do they provide that currently to the comptroller?
They are going to be required to provide that.
Not they're going to. Does your bill do it now?
It doesn't have to say that because, Ms. Davis, they're going to be required to provide that information as a condition of the grant.
Okay, but my question was a yes or no. Does your bill currently require that?
And my response is it doesn't have to.
No, but okay, so you know if it doesn't have to in your mind, so is that a no?
My response is it doesn't have to, because we've already covered that reporting as a condition of the federal funding that we're talking about.
And so every time we spend money in this chamber, we always, or I guess I should say, the practice was earlier in my career is that we made sure that it did what it was supposed to do, and it was verifiable based on a report that was submitted to the members to tell us that, in fact, it's performing as we expected it to. So citizens would have an expectation of what they would get. Does your bill do that?
Respectfully, I would suggest, Mrs. Davis, again, I know I'm sounding like an echo chamber. It doesn't have to say that in statute because it's a condition of requirement for receiving the federal funding. It is a reporting requirement from the federal government to all of the 50 states, not just the state of Texas.
Is this the same federal government that y'all always talk about doesn't tell you what to do? I mean, we talk about that all the time here, that at some point, Texas does what it wants to do. I'm just wondering why we're resisting making this agency accountable to the members of the House. I'm not asking for anything proprietary. I'm asking them to send stuff to the comptroller so the comptroller can tell us, as he does in every other fund that he administers, he can tell us what was spent, how it was spent, who benefited from.
And he will do that with this fund, ma'am.
But your bill doesn't cover that.
He is required to do that as a recipient of federal funding.
Gentlemen's time's expired. The following amendment, the clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment by Davis.
The chair recognizes Ms. Davis to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I have had the pleasure of serving on committees when we spend these kinds of monies, and we've always required some accountability to members. And so this amendment basically says that we're trying to do broadband and connect Texas. It's going to be beneficial to all communities, from telemedicine to colleges to universities to schools. I mean, it's something that we all need to benefit from. And so this amendment just expands access to broadband service in economically distressed communities to support the increased connectivity, because we found that in so many of the economically distressed communities, they didn't have broadband, they didn't have internet, they were not connected. And so when we got into this crisis with COVID and children had to stay at home, they weren't connected. And it wasn't about a tablet, it was about the infrastructure was not in their community. And so this amendment just says that we want to expand broadband service to include these economically distressed areas because they tend to get left behind. And I don't want us to take $8 billion, $5 billion, create a new program, partner with the federal government, and we don't ask for some sort of accountability. That's what this amendment does, is recognizing communities have been left behind, and we're trying to make sure that we get them connected. And so this amendment is to start with those distressed communities that have not been connected over the years of all these different proposals. And when companies come and take dollars to do this, we expect them to do it. If it's something they can't share, then we have a problem. So I don't know why we are hiding about they don't have to do it. The issue is, are they going to spend money on behalf of the state for the residents of this state, citizens of this state, and not tell us where they spend it, not tell us how they use it, not tell us what the benefit is? So this First Amendment deals with a community that has been left behind numerous occasions with these kinds of investments and incentives. This gives us an opportunity to step up and say, we want to change this. There are rural communities that are not connected. There are rural communities, there are smaller communities that are not connected. When you start talking about telemedicine, this might be the only thing that will save a life. So why are we reluctant to talk about these distressed areas, as well as give us a report that you're doing it, so we can think that we do have the best state that it can be. So, Mr. Speaker, members, this amendment just says that we're going to expand broadband in those areas and promote economic development, job growth, and development, because all of it is an investment in Texas. All of it is. And so that's what this amendment does, and I move adoption.
Mr. Reynolds, for what purpose?
Would the gentlelady yield for a few questions?
The lady yield for questions.
Yes.
She yields.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Davis, economically distressed communities, they don't necessarily have to be in urban areas. They can be in rural areas too, correct?
That's correct.
And when I talk to educators and I talk to administrators, when it comes to economically distressed areas, without this connectivity, don't they tend, well, let me ask it in another way. Economically distressed areas tend to have more challenges academically, correct?
That's correct.
Students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, they faced additional hurdles that other communities don't face. Is that correct?
I think that's right. I think we perpetuate the disparity by not developing the communities with all the infrastructure that we have in all of the other communities. We inherently are perpetuating this disparity. And when we have a program this big, this grand, this committed to what its goal is, it troubles me that we are reluctant to say we want full accountability. The reason accountability is important is so that those communities that are getting left behind, we have the ability to redirect. The providers are important so that we know who's providing or supposed to be providing the services to these communities. So again, it is just closing the gap to make sure that we treat Texas whole across the board.
And by doing this, we're going to help make sure that we're closing that achievement gap, correct?
That's correct.
And wouldn't you agree with me that this would be more likely to help these students be productive citizens?
That's correct.
And wouldn't you agree with me that this would help reduce incarceration, because otherwise there's a pipeline from school to prison?
That's exactly right. And again, this is a unique opportunity for us to figure out how to maximize this effort. Broadband is part of a transportation model. I mean, we're going to be using the transportation model, mobile model. It just covers the gamut of connecting the state. That's what this amendment does, is to connect the state, look at all of the tools, create jobs, make sure that we don't leave communities behind.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative Davis.
With that, I move adoption.
Ms. Davis sends up an amendment. The amendment is acceptable to the author's objection to the adoption of the amendment. Chair hears none. The amendment is adopted. The following amendment, the clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment by Davis.
The chair recognizes Ms. Davis to explain the amendment.
Okay, so thank you, Mr. Speaker, members. This was a part of my earlier comments with Chairman Ashby and part of the discussion I had with Representative Reynolds. This is just an accountability amendment. The rules adopted under this subchapter must require recipients of money, those individuals, those companies, those nonprofits, those companies that get monies. They need to tell us, the comptroller, what they're doing with the funds. That's accountability. We do that every day here in the Capitol, require that of ourselves, and that's what this amendment does, is provide a report to the comptroller, not directly to us. We know that they're creating, the comptroller is going to manage the program, but it is not too much to ask for the comptroller to give us a report of the successes and the problems with the funds, if there are problems. So again, this amendment just deals with accountability.
I know everybody is tired. I am too. But I'm more tired of us not being responsible for what happens in the legislature. And when we find communities that have been left behind, when we see opportunities that we could have connected and we didn't, when funds are not distributed and maximized like we thought they could have been and we didn't ask the questions, that's what this is about. Asking the questions now so that when they start administering $5 billion on behalf of us, that we can expect to get a report that says we did it really good or we missed opportunities. There's always unintended consequences in legislation. So our goal is to just make sure that we don't relinquish our responsibility to be accountable for this money to connect the state of Texas. And if the other one was acceptable, this one ought to be too. So I move adoption.
The chair recognizes Mr. Ashby in opposition to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I think Ms. Davis and I had a good discussion about the reporting requirements that are already inherent in receiving the funding from the federal government. And at best, this reporting is duplicative, and it is certainly not necessary because it is already built in as a qualification to receive the funds from the federal government. And for that reason, I ask you to oppose the amendment.
Chair recognizes Representative Davis to close.
Thank you. And you can oppose the amendment, but you got to admit you said it wasn't necessary, so it's not in your bill. And if this amendment's not in your bill, you can't say it's duplicative. You just got to say you don't want to be accountable. We don't want to be accountable because this is not in the bill, and your rules, as you said, have not been established. So the legislature established those rules. This is something we ought to want to know and be a part of in terms of developing a program that will be beneficial to every citizen of this state. And so this only suggests that we would get a detailed report of the funds that went to the comptroller. The comptroller is going to give us the report. Why are we afraid to have some responsibility to get the report? I mean, over the years, we have asked providers, how many jobs did you create? Will we incentivize you to create jobs? How many jobs? Where were they created? We never get answers. And so the chairman says, all I got to do is call and ask. I've asked on the record in different committees, and it never gets there. It never gets to the body. These amendments require us to decide if we're responsible for what's going on. If we want to duck our heads and say we're giving it to the comptroller, that's what you'll be doing when you're not asking to see the reports that they were accountable. But I cannot believe that this legislature is willing to spend $5 billion on a new program. We know Texas is not connected. We know we have areas underserved, but we also have areas that have no service. We're talking about this new improved speed. We don't even know where that speed's going to be. And we're sitting here saying we don't want to know? I mean, that is insane that we would have a bill, this much money, all the citizens of Texas impacted by it, and we don't want to know? Well, why are we here if we don't want to know? Because I can assure you, I can go to any of your districts. They want to know what is it we're doing here to make Texas better and great. This amendment just suggests that a report to know what is working and not working. That's what this amendment does. And again, as chairman said, it's already in there, but he said on the mic to me, I don't have to make it in. It doesn't have to be in there. It can just happen. Nothing just happens by osmosis. You got to ask for the information. You got to require the information. And that's what this amendment does. And I would ask you members, think about whether you want to go back home and say to the members, I don't know where they created the jobs. I don't know what speed you're supposed to be at. I don't know what happens across town. I don't know what happens in urban Dallas and what happens in rural Texas because I didn't care to get the report. That's what we're talking about. So again, members, I would ask you to consider this accountability amendment so that we can know what it is we know. With that, I move adoption.
Representative Davis sends up an amendment. It is not acceptable to the author. The question occurs on the adoption of the amendment. All those in favor vote aye. All those opposed vote nay. It's a division vote. Strike the board. A record vote has been requested. A record vote is granted. The clerk will ring the bell. Show Representative Ashby voting no. Representative Darby voting no. Show Representative Davis of Dallas voting aye. Have all voted? Show Mr. Dutton voting aye. Have all voted? There being 60 ayes and 82 nays, the amendment fails to be adopted.